Now, to the second major point, and probably the first, or at least the most common question that most biblical scholars get about the Exodus, which is, did any of this really happen? So how will I put this gently? No. Okay. Let me soften that a little. No. At least not as depicted in the Bible. First, it's a general point. The stories of Israel's early history that we find in the Pentateuch were written by authors living in Israel in roughly the first half of the first millennium BCE. They were not historians in our modern sense. They were recounting the stories of Israel's past, not producing the verifiable facts of it. They had no verifiable facts. These are oral traditions, largely, that have been given a written literary shape. So on a very basic level, we shouldn't even really expect the stories to be true in that sense, right? Asking for them to be historically accurate as if they are a modern day history writing it's a category error, right? It's a sort of a mistake of genre. Some stories, of course, have a basis in reality, right? They may reflect a truth, so to speak, but that's different from being true. So, for example, a plague of locusts in Egypt has a basis in reality, right? Locusts were a legitimate problem. They did, in fact, swarm, and they did consume crops in devastating fashion, etc. That's not the same as saying that what we read in the book of Exodus, that God brought a plague of locusts on Egypt, is true. Now, even as we ask about the historicity of Exodus, we should distinguish, as we ask that question, between verifiable and non-verifiable events. So, a conversation between God and an individual in the story is unverifiable, right? We couldn't find proof of such a thing, even if it actually did occur. A plague that wipes out all the firstborn in Egypt, that we might expect some proof of, either archaeologically, right? Ooh, look at all those graves, or textually, might be the kind of thing that Egyptian records would make note of, perhaps. God appeared on a mountain and gave laws, unverifiable. Pharaoh and the entire Egyptian army died in a single battle, I think potentially verifiable. 600,000 men, which is to say around 2 million people, moving through the desert, ought to be verifiable. People leave traces of their presence in large numbers, right? Pottery and grave sites, bones, campsites, etc. So when we ask about the historicity of Exodus, we should know what it is we're even looking for. So, to get back to the question, of the potentially verifiable events, are any of them verified? And again, to put it gently, no. There is, in fact, really not a shred of archaeological or other extra biblical evidence for the Exodus story. There's nothing in the desert. There's nothing in the Egyptian record. The story of Exodus is just that. It's a story. It's not history. Having said that, does this story have any basis in reality? Is it entirely made up out of thin air? Maybe not entirely. This is, after all, a pretty weird story to just make up out of nowhere. If you were inventing your people's past, would you start them off as enslaved in a foreign land? So a few bits of reality that might be behind the Exodus story. First, we know that there were Semitic slaves in Egypt. Here's a picture of some of them. They're identifiable, in this case, the Semitic slaves, by their distinctive hairdo, or so I'm told by Egyptologists. So we know that there were, in fact, slaves in Egypt who were of Semitic background. We also know that some slaves in Egypt ran away and did so in the direction of Canaan. How do I know that? Here's an Egyptian letter describing that very situation. Right? And this is a letter from somebody who is in pursuit after these slaves. Right? They come to the fortress and they're passing the palace, and the person sending the letter says, if you see them, let me know. Right? How many people did you send out after them, etc. So slaves did run away, but you'll note that this letter is talking about 2 slaves, not 2 million. So the notion, the very basic notion that some enslaved Semitic people fled to Canaan, probably true. That is, however, not the biblical story, of course, but it could be something like the kernel of the biblical story. We should ask ourselves, what in reality is required to have generated the biblical story? Well, it requires there to have been some people, it doesn't matter even how many, some people who made that journey, who brought their story with them, who understood themselves to have been miraculously saved, and who attributed that salvation to the deity Yahweh. Once you've got that situation, everything else can be embellishment from there. Now, what about Moses? Totally invented? Good-looking dude. Okay, Moses maybe invented, maybe, but maybe there's a kernel there too. Again, not because we have any extra biblical evidence for such a person, right? But we can certainly imagine that if there were people who left Egypt, someone may have been their leader, may have spearheaded such an escape. I will say that for me, the thing that, if not convinces, at least leans me toward the possibility that there may be some kernel of truth behind the existence of a Moses is his name. There's something funny about the name Moses. Despite the Bible's attempt to tell us otherwise, the Bible gives us a very obviously false etymology of Moses' name. Despite that not particularly convincing attempt to give Moses' name a Hebrew origin, the name Moses is, of course, pure Egyptian. We know what it means. It means son. And it's, in fact, a standard part of some well-known Egyptian names that you're probably familiar with. The pharaoh Tutmosis. There's the Moses part, right? That name means son of the god Thoth. Even more famously, Ramesses. That Messes part is the same word as Moses, and Ramesses means son of the god Ra. As the Bible goes to some lengths in telling the Moses story to make sure that we know that Moses was definitely Israelite despite his name. We know about his parents. We know about the fact that despite having an Egyptian name despite having been raised in an Egyptian palace, right, he definitely wasn't Egyptian. All of which, I will admit, suggests to me, at least, that there is some sort of distant reality that they're accounting for. At least they recognize that it's weird that the hero of the Israelite history or Israelite story should be a guy with a distinctively Egyptian name. Again, that is not at all to affirm the historicity of the biblical account of Moses. But there may well have been someone with that name involved somehow. All that having been said, we're not really here to discuss the historicity of Exodus. We're here in these sessions to talk about a book, which is to say, a story, a narrative. Whether it really happened or not, I'm going to suggest, is not particularly relevant. I will tell a brief story here. a number of years ago when I was in graduate school, potentially a couple of years after. I got a phone call from my uncle who had heard someone on the radio say that the Exodus never happened. And he called me and said he wanted to know if I, biblical scholar of the family, agreed that the Exodus never happened. And I said, yes, I agree. And he said, so what the hell am I doing every year at Passover? I pointed out to him, and I'll point out the same way here too. What we do with the Exodus story, whether as Jews at Passover or not, what we do with it doesn't require it to have actually happened. The Bible and tradition tells us that every year we should tell the story of the Exodus to our children. It doesn't say that every year we should discuss the archaeological evidence for the Exodus's historicity. It's the story that forms the basis of our faiths and traditions. So that's what we're interested in here, a story, a work of literature. This story is how ancient Israel understood itself, and that's what we want to understand.